In 1944, a 13-year-old boy named Art Shibayama was living in Lima, Peru. He had never been to the United States. He had never been to Japan. He had been born in Peru, where he had lived his entire life. However, that was about to change because one morning, Peruvian police came to his door with a list compiled by the FBI. Art and his parents were arrested and kidnapped to be shipped like cargo up the Pacific coast through the Panama Canal and into New Orleans as part of a covert US government operation. Once in the United States, Shibayama and his parents had their passports confiscated, declared illegal immigrants despite being kidnapped into the United States by the FBI, and sent to a prison camp in Texas, where they would spend the next 2 years behind barbed wire. Everyone knows about Japanese internment camps, but this is a part of that story that you've probably never been told about until now. Between 1942 and 1945, the US government orchestrated the arrest of roughly 2,200 people of Japanese ancestry from 13 Latin American countries. Most, however, came from Peru. These people were ordinary civilians that included shopkeepers, dentists, teachers, barbers, and their children. They had settled in Peru in 1899 as part of an organized immigration agreement between Japan and Peru. This was after slavery was abolished and Peru found itself in need of cheap labor. Over the years, most became naturalized Peruvian citizens. Now you'd think that Peru would have a problem with the US snatching its citizens, but far from outraged, the Peruvian government was more than happy to hand them over. You see, in the 40 years since their arrival, the Japanese Peruvian community had prospered and become visible in both retail and commerce. This made them politically friendless, so much so that when anti-Japanese riots broke out in May 1940 and mobs looted and destroyed 600 Japanese-owned homes, shops, and schools, killing 10 people in the process, Peru's government, it stood by and did fuck all. And so it's really important that you understand that when the United States came knocking in 1942 looking for Peruvian citizens of Japanese ancestry to hold hostage, it did not have to do any arm twisting. Peru was an equal and willing participant. It happily handed over its Japanese Peruvian citizens and happily went on to seize their homes and their businesses, their property, that would end up being sold at auction and purchased by real Peruvians, I suppose, at rock bottom prices. Peru was offered a way to finish with American ships in American camps where the mob had started in 1940, and it took it. When the deportees boarded U.S. Army transport ships, American officials took their passports, their travel documents, the only proof of who they were and where they belonged. They stepped onto U.S. soil carrying nothing that identified them as legal entrants. And on that basis, the absence of papers that the U.S. itself had confiscated, they were declared to have entered the country illegally, despite having been kidnapped into the country by the FBI. What the United States effectively did was to illegally manufacture these people into illegal aliens, which, under the law, made them legally detainable. And so, off they went, incarcerated in the Department of Justice's INS camps in Texas. This same covert operation seized 4,000 Germans from Latin America. If you were a German in Latin America in 1943, you were considered in the eyes of the US government to be an enemy alien. You were targeted, arrested, and shipped to the United States. And so, in what can only be described as one of the wildest fucking twists in World War II history, the United States government arrested and incarcerated German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany and its concentration camps, taking refuge in Latin America because the United States would not have them at the time. The United States did these Jewish refugees the service of kidnapping them from Latin America, arresting them, and incarcerating them with German Nazis in camps in Oklahoma. At the time, the US rationalized its actions by claiming that they were essential for security, but that rationale falls apart rather quickly when you start targeting enemy aliens abroad, also that you can bring them into the country. The truth was way simpler. The US State Department required buddies of Japanese and German ancestry that it could use to trade with Japan and Germany for detained US civilians. Using Americans with Japanese and German ancestry would have been, let's say, constitutionally tricky, and so instead the US went shopping for the buddies it needed abroad, and I suppose Latin America was open for business. Though the US did in fact trade its own citizens with Japanese ancestry, like Don Hasayuki, a US-born 14-year-old boy scout from Burbank, California, who was involuntarily deported to Japan in exchange for American civilians. An American civilian in exchange for an American civilian. And it's at this point that we get to the bottom of everything. During the war, Japan agreed to a civilian exchange program with the United States. Japan was willing to return 1,513 American diplomats, consular staff, missionaries, business people, teachers, journalists, and their wives and children who had been caught in Japanese-held territories. Japan also demanded a one-for-one swap. But the US government could only find 776 Japanese diplomats, businessmen, and religious leaders to hand over. And so, to make up the numbers, it grabbed individuals with Japanese ancestry from Latin America. In short, the United States took the position that these illegal aliens that it had kidnapped into the United States were nothing other than currency. And so naturally, when the war ended and the Japanese Peruvian abductees had served their purpose, the US took the position that these people were illegal aliens who had to be deported, not back to Peru where they were from, but back to Japan. Peru pressured the United States against returning the abductees after having absorbed their homes, their businesses, and their bank accounts. Japan, on the other hand, was really in no position to refuse, having just lost World War II. As for Art Shibayama, his family was held in detention for more than a year after the war ended. He was fortunate enough that an ACLU civil rights attorney, Wayne Collins, would take up his case along with that of 363 other Japanese Peruvians. The result was that Shibayama was one of a few hundred Japanese Peruvians who had their deportation to Japan blocked by court order. In 1952, the United States drafted him into the army during the Korean War, despite his status as an illegal alien. And when his commanding officer applied for his citizenship, the request was refused on the grounds that Shibayama had entered the country illegally. Yes, I suppose kidnapping is illegal. Eventually, Shibayama would exit the United States, traveling to Ontario in Canada, also that he could re-enter the US and manufacture a lawful entry to replace the manufacturer designation US officials had provided him in 1944 when they abducted him, charged him with being an illegal alien, and incarcerated him. Art Shibayama would finally become a US citizen in 1972. Following a class action lawsuit in 1998, Moshizuku versus the United States, Japanese Latin Americans were offered a $5,000 compensation and a curt apology. Art rejected both as insulting and pressed his case onwards to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The commission would rule in 2020 that the US government had violated Art's human rights. Art had already passed away on July 31st, 2018.